Hey, it's Ben. Rahul and I started this podcast because we love hanging out with fellow trial lawyers and sharing ideas that can make us all better. And both of our firms also regularly collaborate with other lawyers across the countries in cases where we can add value. If you're interested in collaboration, or even if you just have a case or an idea that you want to bounce off us or brainstorm, Rahul and I are going to be hosting confidential case workshops the first Wednesday of each month. So here's how it works. If you have a case or an idea that you want to talk about or brainstorm with us, just send me an email to ben@elevate.net, ELAWVATE.net, or go online to elevate.net and submit a case workshop request. We will schedule you for a confidential 30-minute Zoom meeting where we can talk about your case to see if we can help. If you feel like there would be good value in collaborating on the case further, we can talk about that. If not, that's okay too. We enjoy helping other trial lawyers because we know someday you'd be willing to do the same for us if we needed your help. So again, if you're interested in workshopping your case with us, just send an email to ben@elevate.net or fill out a case workshop request at elevate.net. And Rahul and I will look forward to chatting with you soon. This episode of the Elevate podcast is brought to you by FileVine. FileVine has a software program called Lead Docket, which is the gold standard for managing your new case intakes and leads, your Glenn Gary leads, your Glenn Ross leads, and all of your other leads. So check them out at FileVine and manage your leads. We're also brought to you by Steno. Rahul, you guys work with Steno?
Steno is the best in court reporting services, not just in court reporting services, but even some of their technology tools. We're talking about AI a little bit on this podcast, and their transcript genius, where they can summarize and take interrogatories based on deposition transcripts, is so useful. If you haven't tried it, definitely try it.
We're brought to you by Hype Legal. Hype Legal does digital marketing, web development for trial firms. It's owned by our good friends Micah and Tyler. They recently redeveloped our firm's website, so you can check our website out. If you like it, give them a call, and they can help you out too. And finally, we're brought to you by Expert Institute. Rahul, you guys work with them, right?
We both use Expert Institute because you always need to be cutting edge in the experts that we use in our cases. Going to the repeat experts every single time is going to make you a lesser lawyer, and you always want to keep up, and the best way to do that is with Expert Institute.
Welcome to the Elevate podcast. I'm Rahul Ravipudi.
And I'm Taylor Asen, filling in for Ben.
I love this. Taylor, great to see you. Happy New Year. We got an upgrade as a co-host, and this is fantastic.
We couldn't go much lower, so it's nice to be here.
So Ben has yet to show up in the new year for our podcast. He has yet to pay me on our bet again with the 12 lobsters coming our way. What's the deal?
He's actually litigating a case right now. That's why he's not here. It's nice. I'm taking over the podcasting and he's doing some legal work. So we're shaking things up.
I love it. Well, it's great to see you.
Yeah, you too.
How's everything going over there in Maine?
It's good. We spent last week in Denver at a strategic planning meeting, which we do out there every year, which is great. Went to the rodeo, which was pretty unique experience. It was great. I mean, I loved it, but it's like being in another world. And Ben stayed till Saturday and got to go to that amazing Broncos-Bills game, which I know broke your heart.
Yes.
It broke mine too. I just think Josh Allen is just such a unique player, and I love watching him.
Yeah.
But I felt sad for Bo Nix too. It's going to be, of course, the groundwork has been laid for the Patriots to just walk into the Super Bowl.
It's unreal.
As usual.
Yes. Nothing could be more frustrating for me, but
sorry to bring it up.
Man. Yeah. Well, we have the distinct privilege of having Margaret Donovan here. Margaret, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. And I should add that I am from Buffalo, New York. So I also had my heart broken this past weekend.
No kidding.
It was very traumatic for our family yet again. But, there's always next year for the Buffalo Bills.
How did the whole family react?
Well, my 4 and 2-year-old were unimpressed from the beginning to the end. But my husband was, despondent for a few hours, but he's bounced back. There's going to be another season. So, but we will have a new head coach, it looks like.
I know. What's your reaction to that?
I just think it's really hard to be a head coach. He turned around the team, and I know it has been almost a decade and no Super Bowl, but Buffalo fans have gone many decades without a Super Bowl. So it's hard to look too poorly on what he's done to the team and for the city. So, but I get it. It's a business, and people want one specific result in that type of business.
Yep. I'm on the fence on it too. So I thought he was a really good culture to the team and really brought
Yes.
everybody together. And, really hard in the NFL to do that with all these strong personalities, but they always seem to gel.
The thing about the NFL is
Yeah.
it's not like coaching in the NBA, or it's really running a huge corporation, right? And it's so
Yes.
much of what goes on we can't see. And so it's always hard to know like what is going on behind the scenes that causes these breaks.
I know.
Yep.
Well, he was like about to be sainted in Buffalo, so I think it's bittersweet for the city, definitely.
I realized, Margaret, learning a little more about you, that we have some overlap. I know you now are working with Mike Wishney some, right?
Oh yeah,
My
of
former
course.
mentor.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm interested to hear sort of how you got here. You've taken, it seems like a pretty unusual route to plaintiff's work. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, yeah, it has been unusual, but I will say I've never been more certain that I'm in the exact place where I'm supposed to be, notwithstanding sort of scenic route that I took. I joined Koskoff after 12 years in government service. So, right after I graduated college, I was in ROTC in college. So, I got a 4-year scholarship. I went to college and started in 2004. So, if you can think back then, we had just invaded Iraq and nobody was really sure what was happening. And I remember my parents being, really nervous about me doing ROTC in college, and knowing that we had just started. I mean, we didn't start them, but we had just become involved in 2 wars in Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq.
Are you from an army family?
I'm not. No, I'm the only one in my direct. I mean, my grandfather was drafted like everybody else, but I'm the only one in my direct family. I went to college knowing that I was going to have this commitment after, and then in college I decided to go to law school, which meant that when I left and actually started my active duty assignment, I would be in something called the JAG Corps, which is the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and it's basically Army lawyers. So, graduating law school, I did a year at an insurance defense firm in New York, just pretty much treading water until my basic course started with the Army. And then I joined the Army, and it was just the most fun, wild adventure ever. I did 6 years in the Army as an Army JAG officer, and I spent half of it overseas. My first assignment was in South Korea. My first assignment was in the Korean Peninsula. It was just an interesting place to go after living in New York, upstate New York, and New York City for so long. And then I joined a unit called the 101st Airborne, which is an infantry division, and I deployed with them to Iraq. And then at that same time that I was in Iraq, which was about 2016, then President Barack Obama opened up special forces positions to women. And so prior to that policy change, positions within the Army Special Forces unit, so the Green Berets, that didn't actually require you to go through special forces training. So, like support positions, like a lawyer, like a doctor, like the finance person or their HR person. The policy before President Obama was that, like, even if you don't even need to go through special forces training, we still just don't want women in those positions. And it was silly because, what is the difference between male legal advice and female legal advice when you're talking about something like airstrikes? So that policy changed, and I took the opportunity to go to a unit called 5th Special Forces Group. And that is also based in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And when I joined that group, I was basically a lawyer for the Green Berets. And I deployed with them to Raqqa province in Syria in 2017. And around the same time, my husband got a job had been working at Notre Dame. He's an economics professor. Around the same time, my husband got a job at Yale at the business school here. And so I had kind of had my adventure in Korea and Iraq and Syria. I deployed to Africa as well at one point with the 101st. I had done a lot in 6 years, and we just decided, let's, find some place to be stationary. Yale is a really good job. And we moved to Connecticut, and we didn't have any, family nearby or anything like that. And the easiest transition for me out of the military at that point was the Department of Justice. And so I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office right here in New Haven. So my husband and I were finally living together after being long distance for so long. And I had this really great job as a federal prosecutor. So it was a very easy transition.
Before we get to that job, can I just ask you a few silly questions about
Yeah,
the
of
JAG
course.
Corps? My wife is a lawyer and has worked in house at companies, and there's always sort of a tension with the lawyers, right? I mean, the people in the business side don't always love the lawyers telling them what they can and can't do.
Yeah.
My guess is that when you're dealing with special forces, it's like that on steroids, right? Like, I mean,
Oh,
is it a lot of
completely.
saying no? Yeah.
Completely. I mean, it's a very fine line to walk. And I find that a lot of people, a lot of lawyers, JAG officers that go to these special forces units, you can take one of two tacks. You can say no to everything, because I think the average person would be like shocked what the special forces do on a daily basis. And that's not as if they're doing anything illegal, but these are really intense operations that they're doing. Or you can just integrate yourself as much as possible within the unit so that you're part of the planning phase and you almost like save your nose, so to speak, so that you have more credibility with them. And it's not unlike being an in-house counsel or a general counsel where, if you play your cards wrong, you're not even at the table when they're planning something. And you're just walking into a room after, this very serious operation happened and asking people what happened. And so what I tried to do, and I think what a lot of my mentors in the JAG Corps advised me to do and did themselves, is integrate as much as you can with the unit. So that comes in the form of going to the specialty schools that the units go to. So for example, I became a paratrooper and I became air assault qualified, which means you learn how to rappel out of helicopters. I went to munitions courses to learn about the different munitions and the different like blast effects and collateral damage that each of the munitions formed. None of that, I mean, some of it had like tangential relation to being an attorney and working in these combat operations. But for the most part, it was just a way of saying, like, I know what you're going through. I did these schools too. And I know that the type of training that you have and that you should be, given some amount of deference, commanders and soldiers, that you know what you're doing in combat operations. And I'm not just going to be, the lawyer that shows up with a notepad and a highlighter and saying, like, you guys are doing everything wrong. So the idea is
Right.
to integrate as much as possible. And even in Syria, my commander would make a point to bring me out to what's called the front line, the forward line of troops, and just to see what it was like on the ground, because it's easy to sit in a headquarters. In Baghdad, I was mostly just in a headquarters through most of the deployment. With the Green Berets, it was different. And so if you are just sort of sitting in this like safe, contained area, watching things on drone feeds, it's hard to really get a feel for what the people on the ground are going through unless you go out there. So I've always been a really strong advocate, and I've taught this in like lectures at the law school here, that you have to be as forward integrated as possible if you want to be an effective attorney.
I just had another question about this. This is fascinating. So, when you're with the Green Berets as the lawyer, and I don't know if this even is a distinguishment, but are you a lawyer for the government, or are you trying to protect each of the Green Berets from not getting court-martialed, or like how does it work? And do you have an example of what type of
Yeah.
advice?
So there's different types of JAG officers. And so when I was with them, I was basically a lawyer for the chain of command. So while I would also, I mean, I was a captain. So there would be other captains in the unit that I would help with advice or their legal reviews if they were trying to, for example, do something with our partner forces that needed legal approval. But at the end of the day, I was supporting the command. So if a soldier did something where he or she got in trouble, I would be the one advising the command about how to prosecute that person. So in those instances where a soldier needs criminal defense, basically, they go to another set of attorneys, all within the military, called the Trial Defense Services. And those are basically like the public defenders of the military. So they get somebody who doesn't have a conflict of interest, isn't, talking to the command and on one hand, and then also sort of advising these soldiers on the other.
It's so interesting.
Amazing. Just jumping back to before you went into the Green Berets, when you were at the JAG for 6 years, did you prosecute any cases? And then give us an exciting story from one of those.
Well, I did. I prosecuted a lot of cases. So when I wasn't overseas, I did mostly lethal operations. So I was in something called the strike cell, and I was giving advice on airstrikes to, like I said, with 101st, that was like a regular Army infantry division in Iraq, and then the Green Berets in Syria. But when I was stateside, I was a prosecutor. And so they're called courts martial, and they can be misdemeanor or felony level courts martial. I did, there's some pretty heinous cases. We did some cases with child victims, but then you have almost like run of the mill cases called paper cases where somebody is AWOL for a while and then they get picked up, on like a DUI or something somewhere, and the local police look and realize, oh, this person has been AWOL from Fort Campbell for like 20 years. So they get shipped back to Fort Campbell to get prosecuted. And so you get some of those really odd cases of somebody who like deserted their unit in 2003, and then all of a sudden, they were like caught speeding and they get picked up by local cops and get sent back. So I did a few of those paper cases, but there were some pretty intense cases involving child victims that stick out to me. And a court martial is an interesting animal. It is basically a jury of your peers, which if you are the accused, it's the same thing as the defendant. If you're the accused in a court martial, you can go to a jury of your peers, and it has to be 6 members called a panel, it's a jury basically, who are either the same or higher rank than you. And so in my experience, I had mostly junior soldiers. I never prosecuted an officer. That was just luck of the draw, basically. When I was a prosecutor, I didn't have any officers in my unit get in trouble. But you see these stories of, 1-star commanders or 1-star generals or, high-level officers getting court-martialed. And the funny thing about that every time I see those stories is how they are going to pick a panel, because not only do you have to have somebody who outranks the officer if you're prosecuting, famously a couple of years ago, there was a 1-star commander at Fort Bragg who was being prosecuted for sexual assault. You have to find people who outrank that person and who don't know them, right? So that there's no bias in the panel. And so that's really hard the higher up you get in the ranks. So the court martial is just kind of a funny entity, and they can go either way. Like I think probably the most memorable case for me, it was not that, dramatic in terms of it wasn't a violent crime or something like that, but it was a guy who refused to deploy. And so it was a very military specific offense called missed movement. And it basically means the unit like moved operationally and you refused to go with them. And so I prosecuted him. And again, it was not really at issue. He was sitting there in the courtroom instead of with his unit in Iraq. So there was really no question that he wasn't with his unit. We just had to prove basically intent and sort of play up some of the facts of why he refused. And he had a court martial panel. I want to say this guy was like a junior. I don't think he was quite a non-commissioned officer, which is like sort of a mid-level, I guess, manager within the enlisted ranks. I think he was more junior than that. And the court martial panel could go either way, because you have a bunch of people who, officers and enlisted, who might be sympathetic to, for example, misconduct when somebody is downrange. So if you prosecute somebody for like getting drunk on a deployment, you may have a panel, a jury of officers and enlisted who are like, that's not that bad. So like, we'll find you guilty, but we're going to give you a walk. Because that's the other funny thing about court martials is the panel can decide the sentence. It's not the judge. So this guy, I wasn't sure where the panel was going to go, because I thought, well, maybe they'll just be sympathetic to him. I think he had like family issues. He was breaking up with his girlfriend and he was really stressed. But to this soldier's probably misfortune, everybody on the panel had just gotten back from a combat deployment in one way or another. And so I think they were all looking at the case and thinking, absolutely not. There is no tolerance for this. There's like this army cadence that you sing sometimes when you're like marching or running, and it's the words go, got a letter in the mail, go to war, go to jail. And so that became part of our closing argument, basically, that we made on the case, that this is as basic as it gets in the military. If you sign up, you've got to go to war when your country asks you. And so I think the case ended up like maxing out on his punishment, which is not always a positive thing. But in this case, I think the military just needed to send a message. So it was a memorable case, not because it was particularly difficult, but it was just an interesting moment in time of seeing how these sort of battle-hardened panel members were going to react to somebody who basically refused to follow orders.
Going back to something you said a few minutes ago, I thought was so interesting about the soft things you did to make sure that the folks in your unit knew that you were trying to understand their lives. That seems like a skill and a mindset that's so that carries over so well to what we do and what you do now. there's something, it's hard because we all have so many things we have to do every day, and doing the sort of soft work that doesn't achieve any short-term goals is really hard. But it's also so invaluable. I mean, the time you spend with your client where there's nothing to achieve except spending time with them, right? And learning about them.
Yes, going to their house, meeting their family, meeting their friends, like just sort of understanding their what perspective they're looking at the case from.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't fake that. At least I can't. Maybe better lawyers can, but that's interesting. So you ended up, I cut you off before you ended up then spending 6 years as an AUSA, is that right?
Yeah, then I became a federal prosecutor, and it was kind of a nice transition. The military rules of evidence are almost an exact mirror of the federal rules of evidence. So the only difference was I wasn't wearing a uniform anymore, and I was in federal court as opposed to a court martial. So I did that in Connecticut. I focused on violent crimes and narcotics. And right in the middle of it, about 3 years after I joined, January 6th happened. And I prosecuted a few cases. All of those prosecutions were centralized in DC. But just by virtue of being in a national security position at the time, I prosecuted a few search warrants and arrest warrants of people who were implicated out of Connecticut, out of my jurisdiction, and basically sent them off to DC to be prosecuted. And of course, all of those people are currently pardoned, so or forever pardoned.
Right. When are you heading to El Salvador? Is your has
Oh
your
my
flight been
gosh.
booked or
I know, seriously. It's I mean it's a pretty serious problem. And what it's funny that we're doing this podcast on the 21st, because I was thinking, wow, it was just a year ago when up became down and the grass was blue and the sky is green, and we, conspiracy theorists basically took over the government. So
Yeah.
it's kind of shocking to think where we are 1 year on.
Yeah, we couldn't have imagined like seeing Proud Boys having some connection to our law enforcement agencies. But I guess I don't want to over dramatize this, but you've been a pretty outspoken critic of this administration. Good for you. I mean, we all have, things we understand, and I think we have a duty as lawyers to speak out. So I applaud you for that. Do you worry about potential repercussions at all? Has that crossed your mind?
Honestly, not really. I mean, I feel like on one hand, I'm like not that, for lack of a better word, I'm not that famous enough for the administration to really care about me. I'm just trying like to educate, I guess, my fellow citizens, for lack of a better term, on what is happening. Like, I guess I think what you're referencing is, since probably the past 2 months, I've been doing a lot of media, and it started with the September 2nd strike on the boat outside of Venezuela. And I've also been doing a lot of, I guess, speaking out on what's going on in the military and the Department of Justice generally. And I feel like it's just this weird moment where everything that I just talked about, everything that I learned about airstrikes and the law of war and how military operations work and how you're supposed to do it legally, absolutely none of that has been relevant in my life at all, like since I left the JAG Court. It's like a fun thing to talk about, at dinner parties or whatever, but like it's not really relevant that I know how to do an airstrike. That has never come up in my civilian life. And then all of a sudden, boat campaign starts, and I realized that it's really only me and maybe a handful of other people that have done this amount of airstrikes. And you have an administration that is telling the public and convincing the public that 2 + 2 = 5. And so myself and a number of other, we're part of something called the former JAGs working group, decided we just really need to get out and start correcting the record on this. So I'm not necessarily concerned about myself, and I think, as you all know, my firm has taken on a number of cases against this administration. I think we've got, I've lost track, probably 7 or 8 cases where we are suing the administration outright. And so we've mostly, I think, flown under the radar. And that's largely due to the administration. Like Pam Bondi's DOJ can't find its way out of a paper bag right now. So I don't think that there's even anybody connecting the dots on that. But I don't
Yeah.
really I'm not concerned about myself. I am, there's certainly other considerations. We've seen law firms get targeted.
Yeah.
There's a lot of time left in this administration. So
Yeah.
nobody's really sure where it's going. But if the
We're
alternative
just
is
getting
to
started.
yes, exactly. I mean, the only alternative, though, is to do nothing. And so I think And plaintiffs' firms in particular, I was thinking about this before we started this podcast. Plaintiffs' firms in particular seem very well suited to this because, first of all, a lot of the law firms, if they're not outright compromised because they cut deals with the administration or they're just worried about being targeted by the administration, they're sort of out of the game right now, which leaves a lot of mid-size and boutique level firms to be carrying the water. And I can't tell you the amount of lawyers from larger firms who I've been talking with and who are like, you know, how is your firm like okay with doing this? Aren't you worried about, what if this goes to trial? What if you get into discovery? And I remember thinking, my firm loves going to trial. Like, this is great. Plaintiffs firms are
Yeah.
not afraid at all of picking a fight.
Right.
And they're very good at building cases.
We're
And
outsiders by nature, right? That's part of
yes,
being a plaintiff's lawyer is we throw rocks at the establishment.
yeah, exactly. So it's actually, I think sort of small, I don't know, almost like intrepid plaintiffs firms are very well suited to take on these cases. They also don't have, we don't have the baggage of like government contracts. So there really isn't a whole lot
Right.
of leverage. And I'm going to knock on wood while I say that. There's not a whole lot of leverage that the administration could use to respond to us, though I'm sure people can get creative there.
So, Margaret, just for our listeners, can you share what your perspective is on the administration and these strikes? So, why are they saying 2 + 2 = 5, and how does it equal 4?
Yeah. So beginning in September, the Department of Defense has been using military lethal force against drug traffickers in the Caribbean. And so that means that it's been striking people who are actually lower level, not even cartel members most of the time, just cartel affiliates, somebody who has taken maybe $500 to transport a boat from A to B. And as illegal operations go, those boats are often mixed with other things like maybe they're trafficking humans, maybe they're moving, cocaine and marijuana. So it's a combination of, how I got involved in this is a combination both of my sort of experience with airstrikes, but also as a federal prosecutor. We did narcotics trafficking investigations all the time. That's like a bread and butter case for a federal prosecutor. And so, as a federal prosecutor, that these people, these drug mules, often don't even get prosecuted in the United States because usually it's, like I said, just somebody who accepted a bunch of cash to move drugs from A to B and doesn't really have any insight into the larger drug trafficking organization. In fact, the very fact that they are sort of chosen to make this transfer means that they are expendable to the cartels. The cartels don't care if they get arrested, if they get killed along the way. They're completely disposable to cartel leadership. And the best from the Department of Justice's sort of strategic perspective, the best that you can usually get from a drug mule is maybe intelligence on like, who gave you the money or what phone are they using or what's the leadership structure as you know it for this organization. So for years, this type of thing had been dealt with by the DEA and the Coast Guard. And you would intercept these people and release the mules back to their countries, repatriate them, and seize and destroy the drugs. And Pete Hegseth just started killing these people summarily. Now, there's like some, I've heard some arguments that, these people are afforded due process and blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's not necessarily true. They're not American citizens and they're not within the United States of America. But you can't summarily kill people overseas for something that is not armed conflict. And so there's obviously this moral problem with it, but also legally, if you are not actually engaged in hostilities, then there is no legal basis, domestic or international, to use military force. So what it amounts to is basically summary killings of people that we would never normally kill.
Legally, what's the right way for the United States to handle these boats?
Well, we are doing it the legal way, which is the irony of all of this is that the Coast Guard is still intercepting people without using lethal force and seizing the drugs. It's just that Pete Hegseth finds one once in a while that he wants to kill. So it's very, very similar to blood sport. So they've just picked off certain boats and decided these are the ones that we're going to blow up. And so that one of the most interesting conversations that happened after, I think it was Thanksgiving weekend, that we learned about the double tap strike. Basically, somebody was killed in the very first boat strike of the operation. There were survivors, they were shipwrecked. This is like textbook law of war doctrine that you cannot fire on shipwrecked survivors. You have a duty to rescue them. And of course, the Department of Defense instead killed them. And the most interesting conversation that came of that was, is this a war crime if we're not actually at war? we are not in an armed conflict with cartels. It is horrific, but in my opinion, it's actually just probably murder. Now, it's interesting because the administration says the opposite. The administration has a legal opinion that nobody has seen, by the way. But what we know of the legal opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice is that the administration does view us as being in hostilities with cartels, and that the cartels are led by Nicolas Maduro, who, of course, is a state actor. Now, you will note the disconnect there from when we conducted the Maduro capture operation just after the new year, and the administration said we weren't in an armed conflict. And actually, it was just a domestic law enforcement operation, and there's nothing to see here. So the difference in how we are treating lower level drug trafficking mules, which is just killing them, versus the so-called leader of this massive organized cartel organization is kind of shocking, and you have to live with a lot of dissonance in order to accept that. Maduro isn't even charged with capital offenses. He will be tried, and at most, he could get life in prison. But meanwhile, these basically nobodies that are supposedly under his control, we are killing with lethal force. So when I say, 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5, the administration can't just call somebody a terrorist and claim that now they're part of the war on terror. That's like, I've been telling everybody, if you haven't read 1984, if you didn't read it since you were in high school, reread it, because that is a central theme of the book, that the government can just explain to you what something is and claim that a definition means something that it doesn't, and an enemy is somebody that previously they weren't, but now we're calling them an enemy. That is almost exactly what this administration is doing with the term terrorism, and just expecting people to fall in line and agree that we can kill anybody that we label that.
Take your playbook to the next level by joining a legal network of all-stars at psrplaybook.com. psrplaybook.com is a free digital legal library created exclusively for plaintiff lawyers by the nationally recognized personal injury law firm of Panish Shea Ravipudi LLP, and features video content showcasing the tactics, strategies, and concepts implemented by some of the industry's most successful trial attorneys. PSRplaybook.com promotes learning, shared knowledge, collaboration, and best practices. Get in the game and see for yourself by joining our national network of plaintiff lawyers. Subscribe now at PSRplaybook.com and learn from the best.
Margaret, let me ask you a question, and maybe this will sound Pollyannish. People of, at least I think, my political persuasion are horrified when I say something like this. Maybe it's an even darker point than people realize. But I think if you took all of the possible simulations of this presidency and what could have happened, right, worst case scenarios, I don't think we're at a worst case scenario. And the evidence for that would be, like, take the case you guys did, the Zaid case.
Mm-hmm.
And I love to have you talk about that. But one thing that's kind of surprised me pleasantly is the administration seems to be listening to judges more than I feared they would. And actually, that makes me think maybe there are people in this administration who are quietly trying to push the administration in the right direction. I mean, today, I think I saw today that Lindsay Halligan, is that her name? The
Oh, yeah. She
U.S.
stepped
attorney,
down.
she stepped down, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, there was a while there that it looked like they were just going to say, fuck you, basically, right? We're going to do whatever we want.
Yeah.
Do you think is that Pollyannish, or don't you think this could be much worse if, and maybe they will at some point, the administration just says, we're not going to listen to judges anymore?
Yeah, I think it could be, absolutely could be worse. And I shudder to think about how much worse. But I think you're right. Like, we see, for example, Mark Zaid, they turned his clearances back on. The judge told the agencies to reinstate his clearance, and he attended a classified briefing last week. So they are complying with court orders, and there's been a lot of discussion about whether there's going to be a constitutional crisis when and if the administration decides to defy a court order. And we've seen them toe the line on that a few times. But to me, I think two things. One is that when you see something like Lindsay Halligan stepping down, it could be because they are deciding to adhere to the rule of law and follow a court order, but it could also be because it was really, really embarrassing for the administration to have that person in that position. So I think that there's some element of like, actually, you just look like morons by putting these people here. And you, like I said, could not like prosecute your way out of a paper bag with this person in line. And most of the public, even sees through that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I have been saying, especially since, when looking at the boat strikes and what's going on with Greenland and sort of our foreign policy generally, I don't think that the court needs to, or that the administration needs to defy the courts, because there already is a constitutional crisis that they are leveraging, and that is the clash between the legislator and the executive branch. So the legislator is completely out of the game, and Article 1 no longer means anything. There is no any teeth that Congress have, they're not using it. Any muscle that they have, they're not flexing it. So the administration doesn't really need to defy court orders. Basically, if they can act in ways that can never be brought in court in the first place, they know they're not getting impeached and they can act with impunity. So I think that there isn't really, on these cases, they can sort of pick their battles and say, okay, fine, we'll give Mark Zaid his security clearance back. But the larger fight of like, are we going to go take Greenland? Nobody has standing to challenge that in court. Nobody's going to bring a lawsuit to enforce Congress's ratification of NATO. They should, but I think the administration can get away with a lot by taking actions for which nobody has standing to sue in court. And that's where they can sort of get the furthest away from constitutional norms without being reined in by somebody.
I got a separate question, Margaret.
Yeah.
This is so fun. Former JAG officer, DOJ, and all these current events. Okay, Senator Kelly
Oh, yeah.
said, he said, don't follow illegal orders or words to that effect. And then the administration is taking away his privileges and then he's suing back. What's your take on the comments and what's right and wrong here?
Oh, I love it. I love Senator Kelly's suit. I know that his attorneys who are on it, they're great. There's a former JAG on his trial team. I think that it's just the perfect case. So this all started back in November when Senator Kelly and 5 other lawmakers issued this video that was telling the military to not follow unlawful orders. The administration lost its mind, which is something that you would only do if you were hoping that people wouldn't follow unlawful orders. There's absolutely nothing controversial about what he said, and he is being targeted by the administration. There's, of course, the basic First Amendment free speech aspect to this, but there's this other part of this, the speech and debate clause, and this idea that Senator Kelly is a legislator who was elected by his people to say things like this and to stand up to the administration in ways like he has done. And so the use of the executive branch to try to silence the legislator is what makes this case more notable than all of the other sort of attacks on free speech that this administration has done. So he filed a lawsuit I think they filed in DDC and the District of Columbia District Court. And I mean, I think that the administration is going to have a very hard time defending any of this. Pete Hegseth tried to issue what's called a letter of censure against Senator Kelly. And he tried to basically reduce Senator Kelly's, when you retire from the military, you continue to draw pay and benefits based on your retirement. But because of that, there's this nuance in the law that says that you're still technically subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, which is the military penal law. So when you're a retiree, you can technically be called back onto active duty if you have committed misconduct under the UCMJ. It almost never happens because first of all, if you're a retiree, you're probably not in the age of your life where you're committing grievous misconduct. But even if you were, the state or the feds can deal with it before the military can. And it's a lot more economical for them to do that than to haul somebody back on active duty and court-martial them. So what happened with Senator Kelly is they did not pursue UCMJ because they could not, because there is no criminal offense. But they instead issued what's called a letter of censure, and they are attempting to reduce him in rank. But the law on that particular outcome, that adverse action, is so clear that your retirement rank is based on your service record, which should be common sense. That's a pretty logical rule. So that means that if you wanted to reduce somebody in rank, you have to find something that happened during their time in service and reduce them based on that. You can't reduce somebody in rank after they've already retired. So as one of my colleagues said, who's commented on this a lot, that case is dead on arrival. There is no way that the administration could win. The law is completely black on white on it, which leaves you to wonder, why are they even pursuing that in the first place? And the answer that most people have come up with is because they're just trying to intimidate people. They're trying to threaten them. And what Senator Kelly is doing is saying, I'm not going to be scared by you. And Senator Kelly's service record is probably as good as anybody else who's served in the armed forces and other public service. So he's not somebody who's going to be threatened by this. And I think his lawsuit is pretty bulletproof. So and looking forward to watching that play out.
So what's your take on how the Supreme Court takes all of these Trump crazy moves and then somehow rationalizes at least some of them? And then is there any concern with the Senator Kelly issue that the slam dunk no brainer somehow ends up in front of the Supreme Court? Who knows what happens?
Well, I think the only way it would end up in front of the Supreme Court is if the administration puts it on an emergency docket somehow. So he's asked for a temporary restraining order and an injunction. So it is possible if a court rules in his way that the government could say that there's in a national emergency based need for the administration to pursue this. But that is completely undercut by the facts. But you're right to be concerned about that because we have seen this administration rely on so-called emergency powers for the past year to try to get its case held and ruled favorably by the Supreme Court in what's called the shadow docket. So basically, something happens at the district court level. The government claims that this ruling against them is going to be a threat to the president's national security authorities, or there's otherwise an emergency that the executive branch needs to respond to. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court issues a ruling basically saying that they're not going to ever challenge the idea that the president can sort of determine whether or not there's an emergency, or they don't want to intrude on these national security authorities. And then they send the case back down, ruling for the president, but not giving any legal analysis on the actual case. So it's been extremely unhelpful to the lower courts, and it's created basically a really jarbled mess of a lot of different cases and different sort of streams of actions. So I think like a lot of people's problem with what the Supreme Court is doing is that although there is a deference to the executive branch on issues of national security and national emergencies, it is not an infallible determination. It doesn't mean that the executive branch can't be wrong sometimes. It just means that they get the benefit of the doubt. And the Supreme Court has basically been treating that as infallibility. And the idea is that the Supreme Court is looking at this from the perspective of all presidents. So they're trying not to tailor opinions. And I'll play devil's advocate for a second here. They're trying not to tailor their opinion just to President Trump, because that means that the next president that comes in that decides that something's a national emergency, that some activist group doesn't want to be a national emergency, that could curtail that next executive. So I understand that perspective, but I think when you have something, for example, deploying the National Guard to Portland, when in fact there is no riot and no emergency, or in Minnesota, if we were to invoke the Insurrection Act, the facts on the ground are simply completely untethered to that determination. And I think a judge has used that exact phrase in determining that. So it's difficult to watch the Supreme Court do that when I'll try to think of an example. But basically, if you were allowed to, if there was a law that said you can invoke the Insurrection Act if it's really rainy out, and the president decides to invoke it on a day that it is sunny and bright and 70 degrees, and somebody appeals that, the Supreme Court in that situation would say, well, the president gets to decide whether or not it's rainy, and we don't want to block in any former president from determining that it's not rainy enough or that it's too rainy. And meanwhile, the rest of us are looking around and saying, but it wasn't raining, it was sunny. So why can you sort of flip the facts on that? And why are we just accepting what the president said to be true? So it's there's a lot of frustration with the amount of deference being given to the executive, and that's not balanced with, looking at court being allowed, and I think required, to look at the facts on the ground of what's actually happening.
Margaret, I wanted to ask you, well, a larger question is sort of what topics having to do with this administration you think plaintiffs' lawyers should be focusing on. But a sub-question of that has to do with ICE. ICE has sort of come to Maine in a big way over the last week, and it's on the top of my mind. I know that in California, there's a movement to have a state cause of action, which I have no idea if it seems like it should be preempted. But in any event, if there are arrests of people or detainment of people where there's no, people are detained who should not be, right? Those people can bring civil rights claims, right?
They can, but it's a very tough hill to climb. So not contrary to what JD Vance has said, ICE does not have absolute immunity. They have something called qualified immunity. And we're dealing with this actually in a few cases, and I think most plaintiffs' lawyers who do government litigation probably are familiar with this, but it's a very high standard to try to prove that somebody was acting completely outside of any discretion that they might have had to do something. And when an ICE officer is doing what would otherwise be a routine arrest, but they had an innocent, and I use that word loosely, but sort of a good faith mistake of who they were detaining, they're not going to be held civilly liable for that. So I think that is difficult. But you are right that states are, I think Minnesota was thinking about this as well. States are beginning to try to create civil actions that they could use supposedly to enforce civil liability against officers that do that. I think the answer, unfortunately, has to come from Congress. I know our Senator Blumenthal in Connecticut is introducing legislation that would basically codify the right for people to sue ICE if their rights have been violated and sort of open up a hole in this qualified immunity doctrine. But it is odd, and like something that you just said just stuck with me about ICE is coming to Maine, because I had this conversation with my babysitter just yesterday, who was kind of upset because somebody that she loved may be involved in this or may become a target. And my response to her was, ICE isn't really here in Connecticut. It's happening in Minnesota. It's happening in other places, but we haven't seen a whole lot of activity here. The surge and the focus of federal assets right now is in Minneapolis, and one of the sort of dark benefits to that is that there's not enough people to cover the rest of the country. But as I heard myself explaining that, I was just thinking how screwed up that is. That's like saying, well, we're not in a hostile territory yet. Other places are bad, but we're still safe. We're in a safe zone. And that is such a bizarre thing. I mean, that's something that I would say, this is a little extreme comparison, but that's something that I would say in Iraq or Syria. I would be like, yeah, we're in the green zone here in Baghdad. We're not in hostile territory. Obviously, I'm not at that, same level of hostilities, but it is an odd thing to be describing to somebody that our region is still safe, but it's probably coming in the next couple of years.
Nobody in Maine, I think, really knows what's going on, but there's been a lot of rumors. And Lewiston, which is where our firm is, we're right next door, has a large population of African refugees. And it's been like a ghost town, right? And the schools in Portland, which have a lot of African folks, I mean, people aren't going to school, right? It's like,
yeah.
I mean, it sort of does remind you of a war-torn country.
Yeah. And
it's really sad.
One of the first executive orders that was signed and one of the first policies that the Department of Homeland Security issued was that they are no longer abiding by the sensitive locations policy, which was saying, to your point, that ICE will not interrupt a school classroom or church or a hospital. And the idea for years had been that you can do enforcement operations, but some places are still, in the case of churches, literally sacred. And that policy is gone
Right.
now. And so you see, that the fallout from that in empty stores and empty schools and empty churches. And you're right, it's not the America that we remember. And it's not the America that I think most people want.
Do you see places where those of us who, I think probably a lot of our listeners really admire the work, we haven't even got into that work you've done, are doing on behalf of FBI officers who were discharged for ridiculous reasons? And is there work that you would encourage people who have the skills of our listeners to look at?
Yeah, there is. It's kind of broad, but basically, I would say any skill set that you have to litigate things in federal court or to build a case. And so this is mostly plaintiffs' attorneys, but I mean, anybody who knows how to bring a case needs to be putting those skills to work. In my mind, it may not feel like it because it's so slow moving, but I firmly believe that we are in the middle of a national emergency, and you can still go to school and go to the grocery store and talk to your friends and go out to the bar. So maybe it doesn't feel like that every day, but I really believe that we're in one. And so I would just say that lawyers should be comfortable going outside their skill set. We have partners at my firm doing, helping with habeas petitions for immigration cases. It really just means that everybody needs to contribute in some way, even if it's a little bit outside of your comfort zone. Just figure out a way to put your skills to work, because it's the lawyers and the media. Those are sort of the two last stands right now in terms of holding everything together.
Thank you, Margaret. Taylor, I hope you agree with this. I don't feel like we've even scratched the surface with Margaret, and we've got to have you come back. So
yeah,
we're out of time for today, but I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Thank you very much.